Hello everybody, welcome to the Independent Games Summit. I am happy to introduce Thomas Grip, directly from Sweden, and he's going to tell us about Amnesia and mostly Amnesia, I guess.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so hi everybody. So as been said, I am Thomas Grip, and I'm one of the founders of Frictional Games. For 10 years now, I've been working on various horror game projects. The first 5, I've mainly done homebrew stuff, and for the last 5, I've been involved in various commercial projects. These commercial projects include games such as the Amnesia series, and now most recently Amnesia: The Dark Descent, which is the game that this lecture will sort of focus on. Now, the reason why I'm so interested in horror games is because it's one of the only genres in games that focus on evoking emotions. It's perhaps the only genre in games that does this. Even commercial projects, they can throw away more normal game stuff that you have in order to get close into this horror atmosphere. And horror games is not really even a gameplay style common genre. Most of the horror games you see are action-adventure type of affairs, but I don't see any problem with a strategy game being a horror game as long as you have this kind of horror response to it. Now, this focus on evoking emotion is something that has been very evident in the development of Amnesia: The Dark Descent. And we had to have this really strict goal that we should have a strong horror emotion, more than in any other game we have made before. And because of this, I think that Amnesia is very well the best game we have made so far. And press response that we have had for the game seems to confirm this. For example, Rock Paper Shotgun says, I think it's safe to say that Amnesia is the most successfully frightening game to have been made. And the Game Informer says if Resident Evil is Aliens, Amnesia is Alien. And we have also, apart from getting these good words from people, we have sold over 400,000 units. And this is without any real PR. We have only relied on word of mouth and the press response, as you just saw. And this is for a niche game, like a horror game. And on top of all this, we have actually gotten quite the reputation of being the scary game. Now, here's some example from the internet. Here you have the scared pug. Someone who played Amnesia: Dark Descent for 5 minutes, and okay, that's close enough. Here's someone who drew themselves during one of the scenes in our game. Now, having this kind of response is really, really great. We're really overwhelmed with the response that we have had from this. Now, you can ask, why this success? Why is Amnesia considered such a scary game? Now, I think this boils down to 3 main principles. And during this lecture, I will go over these main principles and discuss them and how they came about. And then I will also dig a little bit deeper and discuss what do these principles mean, what they tell us about game design in general. Now, for the first part where I just talk about the different decisions. So, the first design principles is not to use any weapons. In Amnesia, pretty much what the player does is either to hide or to run away from the monsters they encounter. This decision has a bit of a history to it. It all started out with that game, the Panama Tech demo that we did in 2006, when Frictional Games really didn't exist. A bit due to design, but I guess mainly due to a lack of resources. We didn't have any combat in that game. Now, when we started our first commercial game, Penumbra Overture, overwhelming player response said, you must have weapons in your game. So we thought, this makes sense. It's a very common horror trope that the protagonist has, as a last line of defense, picks up whatever is around and use that to fend the enemy or the monsters or whatever away. And this is really interesting. So we thought that, yeah, we must have this. And in Penumbra Tech Demo, what happened was that the player found all this stuff flying around, and they can imagine themselves, oh, I can pick this up and use that as a weapon. And we thought, okay, if you can't pick it up, then it might break the immersion of the game. So we made a combat system for Penumbra Overture, and we made it intentionally quite clumsy. Our intent was that the player should just hit an enemy and then run off and wait until the danger was over. Now, the arsenal for Penumbra Overture, it had stuff like a pretty clumsy pickaxe, a hammer, and a broom. So we went to great lengths to make sure that the weapons were not very practical. And on top of this, we never called them weapons item. We called them tools. So we made all this. We had this clumsy combat system. We had these non-practical weapons or tools. And we had this vague naming, as I said. And we thought, okay, we're set. We're going to emulate this last line of defense. We were wrong. It turns out, when the player has an opportunity to kill something, they will. If only armed with a puny little hammer and you have this blue demonic dog charging them, the player will just go to straight attack and try and bash the brains out of this dog. And now, of course, two things will happen here. Either the player will find some ingenious way to abuse our system, killing the enemy quite easily, and then because of this, the scariness factor goes down. Or the other thing that happens is that the player will just treat it as your normal first-person hack and slash, go ahead with that, and then die horribly. Of course thinking that, oh God, the combat sucked in this game, and the game sucks. And so, only a minority did what we thought it would do. So, the combat was failed. Now, for our next game, the follow-up for Penumbra Overture Black Plague, we thought we had to mend this somehow, but how to make it work? The obvious thing would be, okay, let's just fix the combat, and we talked about this a bit. So we can add some circle strafing like in Zelda, or we had this mouse control, let's remove the mouse control. But the more we discussed this, we just realized that this is just going to make the game into a hack and slash, and that's not really what we want the game to be. So this time we removed the weapons from the game, and this time not due to lack of resources, but as a design choice. Now, with combat gone, players approached the game quite differently. The enemies were seen as more frightening, and players started to notice other experience-wise more important things. So not only was the whole combat or the enemy encounters changed, but they changed their entire look at the game, and this was quite a revelation for us. Even so, the lure of having combat, it's quite strong. So for Amnesia, of course, we thought, okay, let's do a combat system for Amnesia. So we added a combat system, and then once again we failed with it. It was just too hard to balance it without getting this kind of response that we had in Overture. So I will talk a little bit later on why this lure of having combat is so strong, and also when you remove combat, why the game changes in very drastic ways. Now, for the next thing, no death. So, this may sound a bit weird for a horror game. Other titles in the genre have gone to great lengths to make sure that dying is really, really bad. You have Resident Evil, who have this their ink ribbons in order to make sure that the player doesn't save it off. And you have Forbidden Siren that uses, you have to repeat the entire levels. Now, intuitively, it might seem that, okay, if we have a strong penalty for the player whenever they die, whenever they're in a situation when they think they're going to die, they feel like a lot is at stake. Now, I do agree that this is true, but only to a certain extent. The time when we started thinking about this no-death thingy came about with chase sequences. Chase sequences is very important in horror movies and in horror literature. Having the protagonist of your story being hunted by something unknown or something scary, it resembles this feeling you have in nightmares when you're running but you're not going anywhere. So this is quite a strong emotion. So we knew we had to emulate this for our game somehow. First time we added it was in our first commercial project, Penumbra Overture. Turns out 50% of the people that played it, okay, they liked it. 50% that played it, the other half that is, they just hated it. So you can ask yourself, or we ask ourselves, what is the difference between these two groups? It turns out the people that liked it, they've managed to complete these chase sequences in 1 or 2 attempts. The other people that took more tries and they didn't like it. So the solution to fix this is really easy. You just don't make the player repeat it more than 2 times. Now, in reality, this is not that easy of a design decision to make, because it means that you throw out the trial and error from your game. And trial and error is something that's seen as a good design choice in many situations. And I remember speaking about this on the internet, and it was not that uncommon for people to think when I spoke that you shouldn't have trial and error. They said that, but trial and error, it's the ingredient in games. So I think it's fair to say that it's a wildly held belief that trial and error is a very important part of your games. And I admit I thought this too. And so it shouldn't come as a surprise that when we did our Black Plague, which was the sequel to Penumbra Overture, we didn't fix the system. We have the same death mechanic, and for Amnesia our intent was to still have the same death mechanic, that once you died you had to repeat the obstacle over and over again until you managed to overcome it. Now, it wasn't until very late in development, half a year before Amnesia was to be completed, that we actually decided, we shouldn't have any death. And this came about at the time when we thought about a lot of the design that we had in our game. The design that we chose to implement in our fake death system, or fake death system, I can say, is that the player doesn't lose any progress when dying, but they're teleported somewhere else. And the important part is that we changed a little bit of the level. So when the player had died, he woke up and didn't know what to expect this time around. And we thought that this fear of the unknown would be enough to make the player frightened of dying. And also on top of this, because we changed the map, we can add additional scares. So let's say the player walked through a hallway, and the first time around there weren't the monsters, then they died later up, and then they had to walk through the hallway again. And then we can have some monster hiding, popping up through a corner this time. And that made a great effect, because the player, you can have revitalized the section of the game. And now that we implemented it, it worked out way better than expected. Amnesia is filled with all these chase sequences, but yet nobody, as I know about, has complained about these chase sequences. And this is quite the thing. And even if they actually figured out the system, they figured out that if I die, it doesn't really matter, they still thought it was scary. Some people even thought it was scarier once they figured out that the system helped them along, because they thought, okay, the game takes care of me, then I can focus on being immersed in the game instead. Keep in mind that this system could really easily be exploited. So let's say the player faces an enemy, can just run up against it and die each time, and eventually they would manage to overcome the obstacle. But yet pretty much no one did this. And I think this is amazing, considering how slapped on and rushed this sort of mechanic was. It wasn't until the last half year that we implemented this, and we had tons of other stuff to do at that time. So the events we added and the changes we made, they were all quite rushed. Now, on to the final design principle, no competitive mechanics. What I mean by no competitive mechanics is game systems that, instead of setting up challenges that the player needs to complete, works along with the player and auto-correct itself according to the player's playstyle, or just doesn't really affect the gameplay in any way. And this choice has its base in our sanity mechanic, and the sanity mechanic has its base in that very early on in the project, we knew that we wanted the player to be afraid of the dark somehow. We knew that we wanted, if he stayed in the dark, he should be penalized with something, so he should really fear the darkness. And we first thought, okay, let's lower the player's health, but then that doesn't really feel right, so we added a sanity system instead. We also extended this sanity system to monsters and other sites instead. And we added also for penalties to this. For example, if the player's walk speed, if insane, would be lower, or enemies who would have easier to spot the player if he was insane, and then eventually the player would die. And so with all these penalties in, and we thought that, okay, the player will not want to be insane in our game, we just had to balance it. Now, this turns out, balancing this sort of system ain't very easy. Instead, there's lots of things to consider with this kind of balancing. How many tinderboxes, these are the resource the players use to light up the environment. How many of those has the player collected? How fast do they move through our levels? And how good do they spare on their lamp oil and so on? On top of this, the sanity system doesn't really reset itself. So something that you do, not pick up enough tinderboxes at the start of the game, can have repercussions at the end of the game. So if we didn't find the system balanced, what we had to do was to replay the game several times using different playstyle every time we made a change. It just wasn't workable. So it led to the design choice that was quite drastic, that, okay, we shouldn't have any penalties. We shouldn't have any gaming aspects to the sanity system. Instead, we thought it more as a mood feature. We just, the game system just keeps the balance and moves along in the same way that the player does. It auto-adapts itself. And once we had this kind of system instead that auto-adapted itself, all of the problems disappeared. Plus, players were more immersed in this kind of system. Because they didn't have to beat it, so they can just role-play in it instead. And this kind of auto-correction, it just also spurred the imagination of the players. They role-played what was happening to them and so on. And worth noting is that just as the no-death mechanic, even if the players figured out how the system worked, most players were scared anyway and were immersed in it. And some players were scared even more when they realized this. We applied this kind of thinking to our enemies instead. So we said, okay, instead of having them as a challenge, all these enemies, let's have them as a part of the atmosphere instead. And the way we went about with this is consider the players looking at an enemy. And he has to hide, and then he has to go in hiding in a corner in the oppressive darkness. His sanity is draining, and the enemy comes lurking and sniffing around, trying to find the player. And the player sits there, just, oh, will he go away? And then the enemy comes really close, and then he walks away just in time. And the player's, oh, yes, oh, finally, he didn't spot me, and then he can sneak up and is he still there, and so on, having all these thoughts. But what really happened in the AI was that the AI knew in a way where the player was, and he was, okay, I'm going to just get really close to the player and not near enough, so he's really spooked, and then I'm just going to walk off. And if he just sits still and doesn't run away and try to play a hero, which is changing the play style, he will be okay. And this sort of system, it creates these really tense moments that feel scripted, but they come out of the dynamics of the system. If we would have had a more competitive system that were supposed to challenge the player, having this sort of response would have been a lot harder, and it would have been a lot harder to have it consistently reproduced as well. Now, just going to list the different things I've gone through. So we have no weapons, no death, and no competitive mechanics. With this stuff, I'm just going to give a little taste what we accomplished by these things. And this footage I'm about to show might be a little bit disturbing, so sensitive viewers are warned.
Hey, see the thing. I can see it. Oh no, 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 no. It's coming. It's coming.
I'm not sure if this makes me a little bit... So, I'm not sure if this makes me depraved, but I'm really pleased to see that kind of reaction. So, this reaction, it's quite strong, but it's not a unique moment. If you search YouTube for Amnesia reaction, you will see tons of this kind of stuff. And I want to note again, these principles that we implemented, they were quite rushed. They were at the end of the project. The no death mechanic and the no competitive mechanics were at the very end of when we tried to fix everything else. It was rushed. So I believe there's tons more to explore with this kind of stuff. And this leads me to the next part of this talk, which I will dig a little bit deeper into it. And now it's time for 3 general principles. Now, the no combat thingy, what I think this boils down to is that we should be a little bit careful about finding fun fillers for our games. Fun fillers is something that I think is a gameplay mechanic that once implemented, you can have lots and lots of gameplay with it. And stuff like this is, of course, combat. It's used in pretty much every game. And I think the reason for it is so hard to come up with other interesting ways of interacting with our virtual world, so we do it with combat. So instead of figuring out some system that can consistently be used in a way to move along with the narrative, you just want to drop a bunch of enemies into a room and then place the player there and have them fight them. And this is why the lure of the combat is so strong, and we have been tempted ourselves as well. But as we have seen, once we remove the combat, new horizons open up. Once we remove that weapon that bobs in front of the screen, the players start to approach the game quite differently. And I think there are 3 major reasons for this. The first off is the myth of multitasking. We like to believe our brains are these big parallel computers that can take in input from all over the place and process it all simultaneously. So at the lower circuitry level, our brains are big parallel computers, but at the higher level, it just doesn't work that way. Instead, they are like in techie speak, like single core computers. If you have 2 things that you want to do at the same time, you have to switch between them. And every switch means an overhead. And this overhead means that you lose some sort of time when you're doing something. So this is the reason why you don't want to talk on a cell phone while driving, or if you're watching cat clips on YouTube while I'm giving this lecture, you might not get every word that I'm saying. Okay, everyone get that? So let's move on here. Now, this, of course, has impact on our games. If we have a game that's about combat, then you have other elements in the game as well. If the player chooses to focus on these other elements, they will be worse at the combat. So, if the combat has a competitive element to it, meaning that if you're good at it, it's easier to progress and you get more out of the game. If you have an audio log popping up from somewhere while the player is shooting off enemies, they will just push that audio log aside and keep shooting at the enemies because that's what the game is about. And there doesn't even have to be enemies on screen while you're because for this effect to set in, they can just have the threat of having enemies, and the focus will be off from other things instead. But if you remove this, you clear your head, and the player is free to focus on other things instead. And when we made this switch from Penumbra Overture to Black Plague, where Black Plague didn't have combat, it was quite obvious, this change. Now, the second reason for not having combat is that the tools we give to the player, they tell them what role they have in our games. So, if you give the player a gun, he will expect to go to a shooting range. Now, this is partly because of condition. We've learned to play games in this way in the past. But it's also that once you have a specific tool for the player, an interaction, it will tell the player what role they play. The way they interact with the world changes or defines the way the player is. So, if we want to, for example, have the player that's a detective, we need to make sure that the interactions we have in our game supports this role of the player. So, if we want to have different expressive in games, we need to make sure that the interaction supports these expressions. The larger part an interaction has in a game, the larger part it will form the way the players see themselves. And I think it was Tim Schafer that said that he realized how psychopaths must feel. The only way they can express themselves is with a gun, so all people they meet, they just shoot at. And if we want to have different experience, we need to have different sorts of interaction. Once we remove weapons, we force the player into expressing themselves in different ways. The third reason is density of information flow. I like to liken Amnesia to a sort of sensory deprivation chamber. Once the player is in the game, they start to focus all on this small stuff that they, in a combat game, wouldn't notice at all. So, for example, if a small sound or a quiet sound is playing, they will give lots of thought to this sound. So if they hear some creaking in the corridor, they will start thinking, what was that noise? It could have been a creature stalking me. Oh, I'm hunted. I need to hide. And this just from a little sound. And when watching videos of people playing our game, we see this vast difference from other games that have much more action focus. Now, the downside of having this sort of approach is that it's much harder to design it. As a designer, you know every nook and cranny of the levels that you're designing. So, when you're trying to put yourself in the place of a first-time player, it will be very hard to emulate the kind of experience they're going to have. An example of this is this map in Amnesia. We were sure that it would be really boring when we talked about it and said, oh, there's not enough events. It's not going to be very frightening. The players are going to be bored out of their skulls when playing this. Then it turns out when they played it, they were more than enough engaged. They thought that it was really thrilling, this level. And we had no idea about this. So, because of this hardness, I think it might not be tempting to have this sort of design because it's very hard to try it out. But, I mean, this is a new thing. And the more we can design levels in this way, the more we learn it. And I think it can become much more intuitive than it was for us. A really great example of this loss of information or smaller information density comes from the blog which is called the Awesome Ex Machinima. And the writer there, he tries to play GTA 4 as a law-abiding citizen. And here's what he writes about it, some snippets. Walking the streets, I heard near hours of conversations, insults and quips from the civilians walking the streets that I'd never heard. Things I certainly would have missed, careering down the streets at top speed and shooting back at the cops in pursuit of me. I saw billboards I never knew existed. Buildings I had no idea I could enter. I watched a man on a bench flip through a fully rendered pages of an actual book. A store owner meticulously clean a sidewalk and watch a police officer place someone in the back of his cruiser after an elaborate foot pursuit. Later down, he writes this. Rather than the pour for the course, every infraction, no matter how slight, becomes a thrilling crescendo moment. This made the missions themselves nerve-wracking experience. And I just think this greatly shows the new kind of frontiers this open up with this sort of thinking. Yeah? Now, the next lesson is no proper death. And the lesson I think here from this design principle is that we should be really carefully consider if trial and error is something that we want in our games. Now, obviously, some games thrive on trial and error. I'm not saying that these games should throw them out, but if you have a game where the player is supposed to be present in our virtual worlds, we need to consider, do we really want the player to might stuck in endless loop or be forced to repeat things over and over again? And there are three main reasons why we do not want to do it, at least I think there is. First of all, hard to repeat moments. And I think this is the most important ones. An obvious example, as I've mentioned before, are the chase sequences. When we repeated them too many times, they just weren't tense anymore. But there are other examples as well. Sad scenes, scenes that are boring but set the mood, or scenes that are just sensory demanding. Other media, they thrive on these sort of things. But they're almost absent from actual gameplay, not cutscenes, that is, in our games. And I think that we might actually, or we're probably, missing out on a lot of things if the only thing that we want in our games are situations that are easily repeated. The next reason is that once you repeat something over and over, you start to see below this, you start to see the mechanics, how it all works. And having trial and error not only makes this possible, it might even force this behavior. If you have something that the player needs to overcome, and the player, in order to progress, he needs to figure this out, needs to overcome it, then the player is forced into thinking, how does this system really work? And the way to do it is that they chip away on their own make-believe, and they're taking themselves out of the immersion the more times to repeat it. And I'm not sure if that's something that we want in our game, making the players feel unimmersed by the game mechanics. Now, the last and perhaps more evident reason is just the flow of the player's narrative. Do we really want players to repeat section? Is that a good part of the narrative we want to bring to the player? And I think this is a very, very important part. But some people might say, okay, but if we just let the player play through all this without no obstacles, there will be no tension. But if a horror game as Amnesia cannot have any trial and error and still manage to be scary, perhaps even more scary, I'm not seeing why this shouldn't be possible for other games as well that aren't horror games. Now, last design principle. This is the no competitive mechanic that we used for the sanity in AI. And what we learned from this is once we remove the competitive aspect, that forced the player into overcoming these goals and trying to beat the system, we got a better response, and it was much easier to consistently replicate the behaviors that we wanted. And what it did was that it allowed role-playing instead of the player optimizing a system. Now, what I mean by optimizing a system is that normally what the player does with this interaction once it's competitive is that it changes the game's stats in some way. So, for example, here, say the player is faced with two enemies. Now he has to make a choice here what to do, and it depends on, okay, what weapons do I have at hand, and how much ammo do I have for each weapon? Now, what are these enemies? What kind of stats do I know they have? What weaknesses do they have? And what might I meet at the road ahead? And so on and so forth. Now, the player can choose, okay, I'm just going to do what's fun, but that's not mostly what happens. What happens is that the player tries to do what is best for them game stats or game mechanically wise, and they try to have bad things happening to themselves, to try to avoid that. And what this does is that it forces the players into a certain behavior controlled by the game mechanics. Now, imagine having this sort of optimizing system or optimizing experience for something that is supposed to elicit emotions from the player, like simulating a relationship. Say we have a character that constantly follows the player around. Now, we might come to a situation where the player stands between, okay, either I'm going to do what's best, what my feelings tell me to, or I'm going to do what's best for me gameplay-wise. Now, this might, of course, be interesting, but what I think mostly happens is that the player will just, okay, I'm just going to do what's best for me gameplay-wise, but screw the feelings here. I want to progress later in the game. And if you have a system that have repercussions over a long time, like we know our relationship has, then, I mean, the player is not going to want to jeopardize their gameplay later on in the game. They're not sure what's going to happen for them later on. And this is why I think that if we want to do something like this, we need to remove the competitive aspect. We need to see this sort of mechanics as something that just brings more to the experience. So, and also another thing with having, if you think that, okay, I'm going to have game mechanics, but I'm sure that my game mechanics are going to go hand in hand to the feelings. But as we saw with the sanity mechanics over a long game, it's try balancing that. Try playing your 5-hour game for over and over using different playstyles and making sure that they have the consistent emotion throughout. It's very hard, if not impossible task. Now, instead, what I think, as I said, that we should have see this as something that is just part that improves the experience. So think about game graphics. Game graphics started out as something that could hardly represent what the core of the game was, and then as we have progress, we're getting better and better and better as sort of game graphics. Where at this moment we have all these graphics, and pretty much none of it directly has anything to do with the core of the game. And I think that game mechanics can play the same part, that they don't have to be part of the core game, but they can just enhance the experience in some way for us. Now, to round up this talk and just discuss quickly the road ahead a little bit, I want to just dig into what these principles mean. First of all, I said we just scratched the surface on the things I've talked about here. There's tons of stuff that we can improve that we already know we can improve, and I'm sure other people can figure out even more. But there's a central theme to these sort of principles, and I think that's even more important. We have the no deaths thingy, and we remove the fail state from it. We shipped away on something that's common in games. And what we found underneath, what brought to us underneath, was a totally different kind of experience. We removed combat from the game. Combat's that's so common in games. We shipped away on that, and then when we homed in on what we wanted with our game, we found these other things instead. And finally removed competitive mechanics. We let the mechanics move along and autocorrect themselves with the player instead of constantly setting up goals, and we shipped away on that. And another time we just figured something there below that it was so much more interesting. And there's a pattern here. By focusing on what you believe is the central experience, you can think of changes that can be made to the game, or changes happens to the game that you never thought would. All of this came about when we asked ourselves, what is our game really about? What is the real intent of our game? I think that's the big lesson here. Without this sort of thinking, Amnesia would not have been possible to make. And I don't think this is true only because it's a horror game. That the market, and it's true that the market for horror games is more used to throwing away common game design principles. What that tells me is that other kinds of games have even more to explore, because the horror genre have already explored all this. If we want to advance our medium, we must allow it to be expressive. We must not think about how games are supposed to be, but we must think about what kind of meaning we want them to carry. And that's where I believe that the future of games lie. Thanks for listening. Thank you. Any questions or anything? Ask me anything. Not anything. That was a bad wording for me. Yeah, is there a microphone there? Is it on? Or? So we get it on the recording.
Yeah, my name is Gunnar Wille from the Danish Game Education. And I think you're right in that this thing can be used for other games than horror games. Could you come with an example of what could be done to other games?
For example, okay, now I'm just going to take this out of the top of my head, but for example, a romance game. Picture you have, if you just take the general consensus of how you design a game, you should have made a romance game with points, like hearts. Okay, how many hearts have I collected? And then make it into a challenge or something. But instead you might just think about just let the player move along with this kind of stuff. And depending on, he might not fail, but he might get a different experience what he tries out. Don't punish him for making a wrong move or something like that. And that you might get to the right kind of experience. Don't let the player role play instead. That's just on top of my head, but there's tons of other stuff. I mean, games that take place during an expedition to the Arctic or whatnot. So, come on, that would be fun. Like the John Franklin expedition as a game. I would play that. Anything else? No one else? Okay.
Hi. First of all, thank you. Wow, that was a real brain teaser. But when you talk about pain mechanics without trial and error and competitive mechanics features, and when you talk about not maximizing the game stats of the players, wouldn't that ultimately lead to movies? And where do you get the game back into the experience?
Well, it's all part of, is the interaction part of the experience? I mean, what is a movie? It's a pre-made stream of consciousness that you get. You can't change the movie. But if you have this interaction and the player can move along in the world, I mean, just an example here. I'm not saying that Amnesia is like the best example. I mean, Amnesia is just move along with the player. There's no competition. But the competition can come from other things as well. You can have, what should I do in this? You can still have repercussions to it. For example, let's just say that the player chooses not to save a character due to whatever reason. Then stuff can happen in the game due to them not saving. But it doesn't mean that it game mechanically has to be. It can just be emotional things. I mean, you don't care about a character dying in whatever movie you see because it affects your DVD player. So, okay, now you just can watch DVDs for another 15 minutes next week because he died. I mean, that's not the thing where you're emotionally invested in something, and that emotional investment can be just as strong as a game mechanic can. And it doesn't really run wild at the same pace because the player can themselves change how they want this game mechanic to be, or role play how they want to perceive it. I mean, if that makes sense. Did that answer it?
Any other questions? No. Thank you.
Thank you.